Good morning. In case you missed it, Amelia is going to be the illustration. I forgot the date. Anyway, it's in April. She just did it. Jesus is Lord. And then when we finish, I don't know if you all heard it in the back, and she said, "Yay!" You'll be reminded of that story in in a few weeks. That so fits a sermon I'm going to do for Easter. But yeah, yay! Very good. Very good. We're glad that you're here this morning. So good to see you. Good to have you. Hope that you're having a good week. If you like rain, you had it yesterday. If you like cold, you're going to have it this week. If you like warmth, you had it this past week. You know, you just live in the state of Tennessee. It's going to happen. And so there's even talk of snow. But you know, when they talk this far out of snow, you know usually what happens. Let's hope that they usually miss it. We do have a couple of things we need to be mindful of. We have postcards. These are different postcards. These are Friends and Family Day postcards that simply invite people to Friends and Family Day. Your previous postcard, we asked them to mark the date. Now we're turning the page and we're inviting people. And so we will be in the next 2-3 weeks. They're on the table in the back, but we'll be giving them to you if you don't pick them up. And so we're asking you to pick them up. But pick up as many as you want. You can hand them to people. You can send them through the mail. You can put them where people will see them at your house or to your neighbor's house. You know, that would be interesting. Go to your neighbor's house and stick it on their refrigerator without them knowing. And then when you walk, you know, when 2-3 days later you're not there and they realize it's on their refrigerator. That's a great. Have you thought about that? See if you can get by with that. There's a try. But anyway, we do want to be mindful. March the 30th is Friends and Family Day. That'll also be a Church Eat Church Day. And we hope that you will come and we want this building full and running. It'd be great if we had to put chairs in the middle of the aisle, you know. It would just be wonderful. So let's see what we can do with regards to that. We continue our series of sermons on the Christian graces as found in 2 Peter chapter 1. Today we look at perseverance. The story is told of a man by the name of John Aguiar. John Aguiar was in the 1968 Olympics, the Summer Olympics in Mexico. Aguiar was a marathon runner. He was not world class, but he was a participant in several marathons, and he had thus qualified for his country to represent them in the Olympics that year. And so he did. Long after all of the runners had finished, there came a siren in the stadium because you see, during the Olympics, the marathon runners usually run at least one lap at the track, sort of a victory lap to finish out that grueling 26-mile run. And so the sirens went off, and what few folks were still in the stadium began to look and perk their ears up. And they saw this runner come in. He had bandages on both knees. He was wobbly legged. And yet he finished the race. He was interviewed a little later on about his lap, if you will. And come to find out, he had fallen not once, but a couple of times in the race. He'd skin up both knees, and his forehead had a little bloody spot on it. And someone asked him, or the reporter that was interviewing him asked him, said, "Well, why didn't you just quit?" Aguiar simply said, "My country," which was Tanzania, he said, "my country did not send me 7,000 miles to quit. They sent me 7,000 miles to finish the race." And that's true. It's true that God has told us not to start the race, but to finish the race. Yet somewhere along the line, it gets discouraging, it gets disheartening, it gets to be difficult. The grind is just that. It's the grind, and it's times in which we need our spirits refreshed, and we need times of encouragement, and we sometimes don't get those. We need times in which our souls are lifted up, and we don't get those. And yet we understand one idea, and that is that we've got to keep on going, that we've got to persevere, as we'll see in just a few minutes, because God has called us to that end. Yet, as we look at the Christian graces, we find how each one builds upon the other. Peter reminded us, as we've reminded you on a few occasions through this series, in 2 Peter chapter 1, where Peter says, add these things to your life. He tells them why in the following verses, in verses 9 and 10 and 11 of 2 Peter chapter 1. He says, if you do these things, he says, you're making your calling and election sure. If you do these things, you assure yourself of the hope that is within you, and that which is the end, eternal life with God. And so these things, while not a complete list, are vital, and they are important. And they began with faith. And we talked about faith. Faith being the foundation, faith being the substance. We believe. Faith, though, we add virtue. Virtue is the courage of conviction. It's one thing to believe. We can believe anything, but are we willing to go the extra mile for it? Are we willing to die for it? Are we willing to go, if you will, the extra mile even when difficulties arise? It's easy to say, I believe, but are we willing to have virtue? But then to virtue we add knowledge. Knowledge is the direction of our virtue. Knowledge is the direction of our faith. Knowledge is not just the accumulation of facts, but knowledge becomes then the director for our faith. And how important it is. And from knowledge, we learned last week that we need self-control. Self-control is the idea of holding back. The idea of, well, I may have things that I want to do, but I know that God does not want me to do them. I may have things that I like, but those are not things that God likes. There are certain things that appeal to me, but they don't appeal to God. And so I need the self-control to say no. Why? Because I serve God. But then as we add to that, we add to today, perseverance. While self-control is the idea of holding back, perseverance is the idea of holding on. Holding on to faith, holding on to God, holding on to what you started, holding on to the truth, holding on to the faith, the virtue, the knowledge, and the self-control gets you to that point. But what does perseverance mean? Well, if we look at it from the standpoint of by definition, we understand that perseverance is the idea of enduring. In fact, it's interesting. In most versions, most English versions, the word perseverance, as we're going to use it today, can be found in other versions to have the word steadfastness or endurance. Even have the word patience, although there's a little difference there. But yet you get the idea. Perseverance is the idea of holding on to something, even though objections, even though trials may arise. And so when Peter calls those to whom he writes to persevere, he's calling upon them to hold to God, to hold to the truth, to hold to where they started and to continue on. Now that's important, and we'll make note of that here in just a few minutes as well. But think about to whom Peter is writing. Peter is writing to Christians, to those that have been dispersed, to the great dispersion. And other places, you'll note 1 Peter chapter 1. He writes, though, to Christians that are being persecuted, to remind them to not give up. The whole book of 1 Peter and in many ways 2 Peter dedicated to that idea. Hold on to where you are and to who you believe and who you trust. Hold on to what you believe. Hold on to the very foundation of your life. Don't give it up. You see, it's easy to give up, as we'll talk about as well in just a minute. The idea of holding on is what Peter says. And as he talks about the definition, he talks about really the idea of being stuck to God. While James will remind us that various trials will come our way. Blessed is the man who endures various trials, for when he is tempted, when he's tried, he'll receive the crown of life. Why? Because he's held to truth. He's held to what he knows. He's held to what he believes. He's not let it go. Oh, yes, there are times of doubt, and there were times of discouragement. There were times of potholes and heartaches and hurts and disappointments and discouragement. There were times in which Satan won, unfortunately, because self-control was not always there like it should have been or could have been. But there's still the idea that if I'm going to persevere, as Peter said, I must learn that I am stuck to and I'm stuck with God. Not in a bad sense, not in the sense of, well, I'm stuck with them. You know, sort of like going to a particular event and somebody says, well, we're going to play a mixer. And you think, great. And then you're there with your wife and you think, well, okay, you're going to play it with your wife. And they say, no. And they give you somebody else and you say, I'm stuck with them. That's the way they do with me. They go, oh, I'm stuck with you. Well, we're stuck with God. We're stuck with him because we've chosen him, and because we believe in him, and because we trust him, and because we know that he alone is the Savior of mankind, and we want him on our side. You see, God expects this idea of perseverance if you stop and think about it. God, while he says, okay, I want you to hold to me, I don't want you to give up, I want you to endure, I want you to be steadfast, I want you to be patient, I want you to do what you're told to do and continue to do it. I don't want you to stop. He expects it. And so it's important that we remember that we have been called to hold on. The Bible tells us this time and time again, to be steadfast, unmovable in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58. The Hebrew writer says that we're to stand fast. Paul, in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 1, Paul would write in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 15 and 16, stand fast and hold to the traditions which you've been taught. In Revelation chapter 3, the church at Philadelphia was reminded to hold fast to the truths that they had been given. David himself in the Old Testament was given a psalm of thanksgiving in 1 Chronicles 16 and verse 11. To seek the Lord and his strength continually. He doesn't say just do it once. He says do it all the time. You see, God has called us to perseverance. Now, perseverance is not always fun. Perseverance is not always easy. Perseverance is not always what we want to do. Perseverance is not always what we expect it to be because of all the things we've already talked about. But God has called us to that evening. Don't give up. Don't stop being a Christian. Don't give up because it's easier to give up. I was always coaching. Ethan played a lot of different sports when he was growing up, baseball and basketball and soccer and golf. And the times that there needed to be a coach, it seemed like I was stupid enough to put my name on it and volunteer to be a coach. And invariably, as we'd start the season, you'd look and you would know that there would be, at the end, there would be one or two children that wouldn't be there at the end, that they'd miss games, they'd miss practices. What they'd done is they'd quit. A lot of times parents would allow them to quit without telling anyone. And that was always tough. Sometimes the child quit because he just didn't want to do it anymore. Sometimes the child quit because it wasn't convenient for mom and dad. Sometimes the child quit because they didn't like the coach. Sometimes they quit before they ever got started. God has not called us to be quitters. God's called us to be finishers. A business manager one time was asked what he looked for as he sought employees. What do you look for? He said, well, it's simple. And he pulled out a bunch of resumes and he said, look at these resumes. And they looked at the resumes and he said, did you notice something? Well, yeah, name, address, height, weight, things like that. No, he said, look a little deeper. He says, one of the things you see is that they started this and they started this and they started this and they started that. He said, and he pulled a few out of there he said, you see those with paper clip? He said, those don't just talk about it, they talk about what they finished. And he said, I want finishers, not. It's easy to start, it's hard to finish. God has called us to finish. And so he's called on. Don't turn away from me. Hold to me. And isn't it interesting that if you go back in 1 Peter chapter 1, in verse 5, Peter says that we're kept by the power of God through faith. The word kept there is the idea of we're guarded, we're kept by the power of God, yes, through faith. His faith? God's faith? No, faith. And so, in a very simplistic way, Peter tells the reader, he says, as long as you hold to God, God's going to hold to you. So don't stop holding to God. God has called that in. But we have to know this doesn't come naturally. This is not just natural to say, well, I'm going to dig in and I'm going to keep going. I'm going to dig in and I'm going to persevere. When you think about, as James talks about in James chapter 5 and verse 11, or verse 10 rather, he says to consider the prophets. James is talking about persevering there, and he also, as we'll see in just a second, talks about Job, but he talks about considering the prophets. And when you go through, and I was thinking about this week, when you go through and you think about the prophets, you think about Amos and the terrible, if you will, marriage that he had. You think about Jeremiah, about him being thrown in a pit. You think about Jonah, and you think about him being swallowed by that fish which God provided. And you think about the prophets who went through all of these terrible things. You think about the Apostle Paul, who went through all of the difficulties that he talked about in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. He talked about the shipwreck. He talked about the beatings. He talked about the tumults. He talked about the terrible times. And yet these prophets of old, Paul knew, what did they do? They endured. But it didn't come easy. It didn't just come naturally. It was that which they had to work at. While it is the trying of your faith that works patience, that's what James said in James chapter 1 and verse 2 and 3. It is understandable, and we must know that we must keep at it. For Paul said in Romans chapter 8 and verse 18, I reckon. Now, we didn't know Paul was a good old Southern boy, did we? I reckon. It a little bit differently than what we use it. But he says, I reckon that the present time is not worthy to be compared with glory which shall be revealed in heaven. I like that 8th chapter of the book of Romans. That 8th chapter of the book of Romans is an I do, I can, I will make it chapter. And Paul says, he says, you need to know something. That the suffering of this present time is not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed. I'm going to hold on because the suffering is nothing compared to what's yet to be. So, interestingly enough, that same beloved Paul would write to the church at Corinth, not in his first epistle, but in his second epistle. And he talks about our light afflictions in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. Which is but for a moment, is working in us a far exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we look not at the things that are seen, but the things that are unseen. The things that are seen are temporal, but what about the things that are not seen? Well, Paul answers that. He says they're eternal. And so he says, we know that if the earthly house, this tent, is dissolved, we have a building of God. A house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Paul says, we live and we push on looking for what's ahead. And so it doesn't come natural. It's something that I must work at. I must be encouraged by. I must look toward. Well, it's interesting. God has given us some examples. We talked about prophets. We talked about Paul. Let me give you 2 other examples I think are interesting as well. How about God? You might say, Well, sure, God's long-suffering, but have you really thought about the long-suffering of God? While Peter would talk about the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah in 2 Peter chapter 3, he would talk about that God is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. Don't you like that? Don't you like the fact that God is long-suffering or patient? I mean, I am a royal mess up. You ask me to do something, I'll do it. I'll do it to the best of my ability, but probably the first try, I'm going to mess it up. It may take a second try, and it may take a third try. I'll get it right to the best of my ability, but I'm going to mess up. When we think about our relationship with God, there are times when I fail. There are times when I'm not as strong as I should be. There are times, as we said in the introduction, when my self-control does not work the way I even desire it to be. And while Paul himself said that there are times in his life where he failed, there are times in my life in which I fail. I need that help. God is still there waiting on me. God is the father in the story of the prodigal son. Where's the father? He's still at home. He's still waiting, and he still opens his arms to his son who comes home. God is long suffering to me. I need that. I need that because I fail. And because I fail, God is a great example for me in perseverance, patience. But then, how about the example of Jesus? The Hebrew writer reminds us that we're to look unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him, notice what he says, endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of God. I like that verse. Why? Because it gives me that which I need to hold on to. It comes right after the chapter of faith, the great heroes of faith. Some call it the Hall of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11. That's a great chapter. But it also can be not just an inspiring chapter. It can also be a discouraging chapter. Man, these guys they were the best. They were God's Hall of Fame. They were God's pick of God's people. And look how by faith Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice. By faith Noah built the ark. By faith Abraham sojourned in the land of promises in the strange land. And by faith it talks about how that the world, as you get to the end of the chapter, the world was not worthy of these people. I'm not there. I'm not there. Well, remember, the Hebrew writer didn't write in chapters and verses, and he kept writing. And he says, seeing we are compassed about with so great a cloud of witness, I think that's the 11th chapter of all these people that he's been talking about. Let's lay aside every weight. Let's lay aside all the weight that besets us. And he says, let's run with patience the race that's set before us. You see, he's called us to patience. Isn't that what we said in the very first, on this line? He's called us to patience. The Hebrew writer said, let us run with patience. Let us run with perseverance, race that is set before us. Okay, God's called me. He's called me to run the race. I can't be like those guys. I mean, they were fantastic. How am I going to do it? At verse 2. Example to follow. I have an example not only to follow, but I have an example that shows me about perseverance and tells me about perseverance and tells me about what all I need to live my life. And if he can endure with his help, I can endure. But then you go further and you look at the example of old Job. Job in James chapter 5, verse 11 is an example of patience. And man, if there ever was a man that was patient, it was Job. The book of Job is a fantastic book. It begins with a man, Job, who really has everything that life could give him. I mean, he has children, he has family, He has a wife. He has things. He has cattle, oxen, sheep. He has servants. He has what the world would say, he has it all. And to abbreviate the story, we know that he lost it all. Job even lost his health. And when his wife comes in, she says, Job, why don't you just curse God and die? I mean, look what God has done to you. Look where you are. Look what you're going through. Job, why don't you just give up? And yet Job, in all of that, would not. And then the rest of the book of Job, you pick up Job chapter 3 and Job chapter 4, Job wants to talk to God. Can you imagine the audacity of a man wanting to talk to God? Job wants to talk to God. And his friends feel that. And they're trying to tell him, look, here's your problem, and here's why you're going through this problem. And he just says, I just need to talk to God. Well, finally, as we go through the story, God talks to him out of a whirlwind. And Job gets the answer. He also puts it in place, but he gets the answer. And Job is blessed at the end of the book by God again with everything that he had that was taken away from him. Now, all of a sudden, he has it again. Why? He stuck with God even in the difficult times. So those great examples remind us to persevere when tough times come. Well, where are some areas that we might manifest this perseverance? Okay, we understand what perseverance is. We understand that God's called us to perseverance. Now, where do we put it all down on just paper, but down in our life? Well, how about prayer? What does the Bible say? Does it say pray without ceasing? Does it say that men ought always pray and not to faint? 1 Thessalonians 5:17, Luke 1. We know those verses well. Sure. Those that are weary need to seek the Lord. Isaiah reminds us in Isaiah 40 and verse 31 that they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. We need to talk to God. Sometimes our prayer life gets a little sketchy, because there are things we want that we're not getting. That we're praying for certain situations and certain things in our life, and it just is not coming to pass. We're praying for health, and we're praying for financial sustenance, and we're praying for our neighbors, and we're praying for this and for that, and they just aren't happening. And we want to raise our hand to God and say, God, are you listening? Do you care? Do you care that the servant is suffering? Or like old Job, what he said. And the answer is God does. And God answers our prayers. Sometimes it takes a while, right? God doesn't always, you just pray a prayer and then wake up the next morning and voila, there it is. We talked about knowledge in this series, right? And we told you can't put your Bible under your pillow and expect to wake up the next morning full of the knowledge of God's will. That it takes study, meditation. And it does. Years and years. It can get exactly what you wanted at the point in time in which you wanted it. You're working not on your timetable. You think you are, but you're working on God's timetable. Stick with it. Persevere in your prayer life. But how about when others mistreat you? Well, we talked about the old prophets, didn't we? We talked about especially old Jeremiah. Jeremiah was thrown in the pit. Jeremiah was by the kids. Jeremiah, go read Jeremiah. He had a little rough. He was mistreated people. He was done terribly. And yet he held. Paul himself talked about in 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 11. Paul talked about how that in persecutions and afflictions which happened to him at Iconium and Lystra, that Paul says that God delivered him from those things. I went through those things. I went through a time in which people didn't treat me the way they should have treated me. And yet, even though I went through those things, I held to God. Sometimes, and I'm not proud of this, but sometimes in the church, people don't treat us right. Now, that's the place where we are treated the best and treated royally and always treated the way that we should be treated as God has defined it. But sadly, it does not always happen. You might say, preacher, the brethren will never treat you wrong. I are a test case. I can tell you. And it's one of the most hurtful of things to think that your own brethren would do that to you, that would consider you family, would consider you loved ones, yet treat you ugly. Times will come when that will happen. We don't want it to happen here. We're not encouraging it. We're discouraging that very idea. We want to treat everyone with the kindness and love that follows this series. Keep following this series. We're going to find out, not next week, but in 2 and 3 weeks. We're going to see. Because remember, perseverance, he adds what? Godliness, brotherly kindness, love. There are times in which folks will mistreat you. There are times in which folks will say things and do things to you that won't be nice and won't be kind. And a lot of folks, a lot of times, well, I'm just giving up on God. Well, why? Why did you stop? Why did you stop coming to church? Those people down there, they hurt my feelings. It wasn't God. I'm sorry that they did, but it wasn't God. Don't take it out on God. My father, I said as we closed class this morning, my father was just a high school graduate. Dad was an elder in the church. Dad was a great spiritual man. One time, somebody said something to him about, well, they hurt my feelings. And he said, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. But he said, you've stopped coming to church. Yeah, because they hurt my feelings. He said, can I ask you something? Sure. Do they hurt your feelings at Walmart every once in a while? Well, yeah. Do you still go? Well, yeah. We take things out on God because of others. But what does the Bible say? Just hang in there. Just persevere. Learn to treat them with kindness and love. Just hold on. The series is coming. But when others mistreat you, you be sure to manifest perseverance. Life's trials. Boy, we have a lot of them, don't we? Sometimes there's more potholes in the road to heaven than it seems like there's dry, smooth pavement. There's rainy days. There's difficult times. There's icy days. There's times in which we grow discouraged. There's times in which Satan just gets his hooks in us and I mean wears us out. And we just want to give up. We just want to quit. We just want to say, oh, no, let me throw up my hands. Let me stop. Paul reminds us, don't. Paul would write to the church at Thessalonica, and Paul was very proud of the church at Thessalonica. If you read 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, you see that pride. But in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, he says that we boast of you in the church of God. Well, why was he boasting of them? God, because of your patience, faith. And your patience and faith in times of tribulation and anguish. He says, you are good people. And as good people, you go through some terrible times in life. We all do. That doesn't mean that we're discounting your problems, and maybe you're going through some difficult times right now, and we're definitely not discounting your problems. We would like to help you with your problems. We'd like to assist you in your difficulties. But in times of life's trials, don't give up. Don't quit. Don't stop. Patient, Paul said in Romans 12 and verse 12, in tribulation. Patient in difficulties. Perseverance or patience. Also the idea of living the Christian life. Not easy. But here's the point. God has called us to service, to render service to Him. And we practice that, and we're to practice that all the time. But not just in living life do we live a life to Him, but we live a life for others. And we're not to be weary in well-doing, for in due season we'll reap if we faint not. That's what Paul wrote to the churches of Galatia in Galatians 6 and verse 9. Don't stop. Why? Because we'll reap. We may not see the rewards now. We may not have a lot of thank you cards that come our way. We may not have a lot of pats on the back. We may not have a lot of people that stopped and said, hey, we appreciate what you've done. But you just keep doing. We need patience in living the Christian life. But then we need patience. The Lord's second coming. The Bible tells me about the Lord's second coming. It tells me that it's happening. It's going to happen. Now, when, I don't know. I have no clue when. Matter of fact, Jesus said in Matthew 25, He says, I don't even know. Wait a minute, you're the one coming back? Yeah. You don't know? No, not me. Just the Father which is in heaven. There are those, though, like Peter, if you're still inclined to listen to Peter and talking about the Christian graces. You read a couple of chapters over in the 3rd chapter in verse 4 of 2 Peter. And what are those folks saying? They wanted to give up. They wanted to stop living the life. They wanted to stop practicing what they were supposed to be practicing. Why? Because they said all things continue as they were in the beginning. In other words, you go back and read the context. Here's what they said. Lord is not coming back because everything has gone on this way for years, and it will continue to go on this way. And the Lord's not coming back. Why do anything? Why live the Christian life? Why practice what you're supposed to practice? Why not give in to the persecution? Why not give in to the temptation? And Peter says, because the Lord is coming back. The Lord is coming. The trumpet will sound. The dead will rise. The living will be changed. And He says, we'll all stand before the Lord in the day of judgment. Don't stop. Don't stop until you cross the finish line. John Courtney also was a marathon runner. John Courtney represented the United States back several years ago. 26-mile marathon. He ran. The end, and he hit actually, and he began to get a little wobbly. He was in the lead. He was far in front of everyone, and his legs began to get a little wobbly, and he began to kind of weave and go back and forth, back and forth. He entered the stadium to do that victory lap that we talked about earlier. And he entered the stadium to do that victory lap, and he got a little bit on the track, and he fell. He picked himself up, took a few steps, and he fell again. He picked himself up, and he was able to wobbly make it through the finish line. And when you see the replay at the end, he's mouthing these words, I want to win. And he did. You know why he did? Because he finished the race. He had the perseverance to stay with it. Dear friends, we need that perseverance. Why? Paul said it best in Romans 8, verse 24 and 25. For we're saved in this hope, but hope that is seen is not hope. For why does one still hope for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we eagerly wait for it with perseverance. Hope is yet to be. When it becomes a reality on the day of judgment is what we long for. And so Paul says, don't stop. Persevere. Keep going. Keep running. And in the end, there's a promise. Well done, good and faithful servant. Will you hear that? The day of judgment, will you hear the word, well done? You don't have to miss that. Respond to the Lord's name.